Chapter 23 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 23. June, tired though she was, tossed restlessly that night. The one look she had seen in Hale's face when she met him in the car told her the truth as far as he was concerned. He was unchanged. She could give him no chance to withdraw from their long understanding, for it was plain to her quick instinct that he wanted none, and so she had asked him no question about his failure to meet her, for she knew now that his reason, no matter what, was good. He had startled her in the car, for her mind was heavy with memories of the poor little cabins she had passed on the train, the mountain men and women in the wedding party, and Hale himself was to the eyes so much like one of them, had so startled her that, though she knew his instinct, too, was at work, she could not gather herself together to combat her own feelings, for every little happening in the dummy but drew her back to her previous train of painful thought, and in that helplessness she had told Hale good night. She remembered now how she had looked upon Lonesome Cove after she went to the Gap, how she had looked upon the Gap after her year in the Blue Grass, and how she looked back even on the first big city she had seen there from the lofty vantage ground of New York. What was the use of it all? Why laboriously climb a hill merely to see and yearn for things that you cannot have, if you must go back and live in the hollow again? Well, she thought rebelliously, she would not go back to the hollow again, that was all. She knew what was coming, and her cousin Dave's perpetual sneer sprang suddenly from the past to cut through her again, and the old pride rose within her once more. She was good enough now for Hale. Oh, yes, she thought bitterly, good enough now. And then, remembering his lifelong kindness and thinking what she might have been but for him, she burst into tears at the unworthiness of her own thought. What should she do? What should she do? Repeating that question over and over again, she fell toward morning into troubled sleep. She did not wake until nearly noon, for already she had formed the habit of sleeping late at least for that part of the world, and she was glad when the boy brought her word that Mr. Hale had been called up the valley and would not be back until the afternoon. She dreaded to meet him, for she knew that he had seen the trouble within her, and she knew he was not the kind of man to let matters drag vaguely, if they could be cleared up and settled by open frankness of discussion, no matter how blunt he must be. She had to wait until midday dinner time to get something to eat, so she lay abed, picked a breakfast from the menu, which was spotted, dirty, and meager in offerings, and had it brought to her room. Early in the afternoon she issued forth into the sunlight and started toward Imboden Hill. It was very beautiful and soul comforting, the warm air, the luxuriantly wooded hills, with their shades of green that told her where poplar and oak and beech and maple grew, the delicate haze of blue that overlay them and deepened as her eyes followed the still mountain piles northeastward to meet the big range that shut her in from the outer world. The changes had been many. One part of the town had been wiped out by fire, and a few buildings of stone had risen up. On the streets she saw strange faces, but now and then she stopped to shake hands with somebody whom she knew, and who recognized her, always with surprise, and spoke but few words. And then, as she thought, with some embarrassment, half unconsciously, she turned toward the old mill. There it was, dusty and gray, and the dripping old wheel creaked with its weight of shining water, and the muffled roar of the unseen dam started an answering stream of memories surging within her. She could see the window of her room in the old brick boarding house, and as she passed the gate she almost stopped to go in, but the face of a strange man who stood in the door with a proprietary air deterred her. There was Hale's little frame cottage, and his name, half washed out, was over the wing that was still his office. Past that she went with a passing temptation to look within and toward the old schoolhouse. A massive new one was half built of gray stone to the left, but the old one, with its shingles on the outside that had once caused her such wonder, still lay warm in the sun, but closed and deserted. There was the playground where she had been caught in Ring Around the Rosy, and Hale and that girl teacher had heard her confession. She flushed again when she thought of that day, but the flush was now for another reason. Over the roof of the schoolhouse she could see the beech tree where she had built her playhouse, and memory led her from the path toward it. She had not climbed a hill for a long time, and she was panting when she reached it. There was the scattered playhouse. It might have lain there untouched for a quarter of a century, just as her angry feet had kicked it to pieces. On a root of the beech she sat down, and the broad rim of her hat scratched the trunk of it and annoyed her. So she took it off and leaned her head against the tree, looking up into the underworld of the leaves, through which a sunbeam filtered here and there, one striking her hair, which had darkened to the duller gold, striking it eagerly, unerringly, as though it had started for just such a shining mark. Below her was outspread the little town, the straggling, wretched little town, crude, lonely, lifeless. She could not be happy in Lonesome Cove after she had known the Gap, and now her horizons had so broadened that she felt now toward the Gap and its people as she then felt toward the mountaineers, for the standards of living in the Cove, so it seemed, were no farther below the standards in the Gap than they in turn were lower than the new standards to which she had adapted herself while away. Indeed, even that bluegrass world where she had spent a year was too narrow now for her vaulting ambition, and with that thought she looked down again on the little town, a lonely island in a sea of mountains, and as far from the world for which she had been training herself as though it were in mid-ocean. Live down there? She shuddered at the thought, and straightway was very miserable. The clear piping of a wood thrush rose far away. A tear started between her half-closed lashes, and she might have gone to weeping silently had her ear not caught the sound of something moving below her. Someone was coming that way, so she brushed her eyes swiftly with her handkerchief and stood upright against the tree. And there again Hale found her, tense, upright, bareheaded again, and her hands behind her. Only her face was not uplifted and dreaming. It was turned toward him, unstartled and expectant. He stopped below her and leaned one shoulder against a tree. "I saw you pass the office," he said, "and I thought I should find you here." His eyes dropped to the scattered playhouse of long ago, and a faint smile that was full of submerged sadness passed over his face. It was his playhouse, after all, that she had kicked to pieces. But he did not mention it, nor her attitude, nor did he try in any way to arouse her memories of that other time at this same place. "I want to talk with you, June, and I want to talk now." "Yes, Jack," she said tremulously. For a moment he stood in silence, his face half turned, his teeth hard on his indrawn lip, thinking. There was nothing of the mountaineer about him now. He was clean-shaven and dressed with care. June saw that. But he looked quite old. His face seemed harried with worries and ravaged by suffering, and June had suddenly to swallow a quick surging of pity for him. He spoke slowly and without looking at her. "June, if it hadn't been for me, you would be over in Lonesome Cove and happily married by this time, or at least contented with your life, for you wouldn't have known any other." "I don't know, Jack. I took you out, and it rests with you whether I shall be sorry I did. Sorry wholly on your account, I mean," he said hastily. She knew what he meant, and she said nothing. She only turned her head away slightly, with her eyes upturned a little toward the leaves that were shaking like her own heart. "I think I see it all very clearly," he went on in a low and perfectly even voice. "You can't be happy over there now. You can't be happy over here now. You've got other wishes, ambitions, dreams now, and I want you to realize them. I want to help you realize them all I can, that's all." "Jack," She helped